მოგესალმებით, ძალიან დიდი მადლობა მობრძანებისთვის. პირველ რიგში დიდი მადლობა ბატონ ენრიკო სობეხანოს, ჩვენს ძვირფას სტუმარს, რომელმაც მოგცა შესაძლებლობა დღეს ჩვენ სტუდენტებს, ჩვენ დარგის სპეციალისტებს მოესმინათ მისთვის. ჩვენთვის ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანია ახალი მეთოდოლოგიური ცოდნა, დასავლური გამოცდილება. ჩვენ პოსტსაბჭოთა ქვეყანა ვართ და თუ ბატონს ჩვენს სტუმარს ჰქონდა შესაძლებლობა გაევლო თბილისის ქუჩებში, ის მიხვდებოდა, რას ნიშნავს ის ეკლექტიზმი, ის მეთოდოლოგიური, ასე ვთქვათ, გაუმართავობა, რაც სჭირთ ხოლმე ჩვენაირ ქვეყნებს. ამის მიუხედავად დიდი გამოცდილების ქვეყანა ვართ, მე მახსენდება 100-120 წლის წინანდელი ამბავი, როდესაც ილია ჭავჭავაძემ ცნობილ არქეოლოგს ბერლინის ეგვიპტური მუზეუმის დირექტორს კარლ ფრიდრიხ ლემანჰაუს თხოვა დახმარება, რომ საქართველოში იმ ავსტრიულ ჯგუფთან ერთად, რომელიც თბილისში მუშაობდა, გერმანელების შთამომავლები მე-18 საუკუნის ბოლოს და მე-19 საუკუნის დასაწყისში აქ ჩამოსულები დახმარებოდა სწორედ მას, რომ ჩამოეყვანათ საქართველოში ევროპელი არქიტექტორები და ილია შემდეგნაირად განმარტავდა მის გადაწყვეტილებას. მე მგონი ეს სწორი იქნება, იმიტომ რომ საქართველო არის ადგილი, სადაც დასავლეთს უკეთესმის აღმოსავლეთის ენა და პირიქით აღმოსავლეთს დასავლეთის ენაო. იმ ძიმე გამოცდილებამ ჩვენ რაღაცნაირად დაგვაკარგვინა ბევრი რამ, დაგვაკარგვინა ზოგჯერ ამ ენის გაგების უნარიც. მე ძალიან მიხარია, რომ ჩვენი ახალგაზრდობა ყოველთვის ინტერესით მოდის და ისმენს ამ ტიპის საერთაშორისო გამოცდილებას. ამისთვის პირველ რიგში დიდი მადლობა მინდა უთხრა ჩვენს თანამონაწილე ორგანიზაციებს დღევანდელი აი ამ მოხსენების ჩატარებაში, ვინც დაგვეხმარა, თბილისის მერიას, სამშენებლო კომპანია აქსის და არტ სტუდიოს. ხა მე დიდ დროს აღარ წაგართმევთ და სიტყვას გადავცემ ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტის ასოცირებულ პროფესორს ბატონ გიორგი საუდაშვილს, ორი სიტყვით წარგვიდგინოს სტუმარი. კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა.
დიდი მადლობა პირველ რიგში მობრძანებისთვის. ძალიან გამიჭირდება მე რამე გამწვევა, მაგრამ მოკლედ რო არ შეგაცნოთ, მე მქონდა პირადად ბედნიერება 2012 წელს ყოფილიყავი ბატონი ენრიკეს სტუდენტი და ეს რატო გადავწყვეტეთ საერთოდ ამ აღონიზების ჩატარება, თავარი მიზანი რაც იყო არის პრობლემები, რაც დღეს საქართველოში არქიტექტურის მხრივ გვაქვს და აქცენტი ასე ვთქვათ ძველ ქალაქზე, სადაც ამ ისტორიულ უბანში არ არსებობს ერთიანი მეთოდი, აი მიდგომა თუ რა არის სწორი, ანუ როგორ მიუდგეთ და როგორ უნდა განვითარდეს არქიტექტურა ამ მიმართულებით. მე ბევრს აღარ ვისაუბრებ, სამგეთ პროფესორ ენრიკე სობეხანოს, რომელიც თავის პროექტების მაგალითზე დარწმუნებული ვარ ძალიან საინტერესო გამოცდილებას მოგანიჭებთ ლექციის მსვლელობისას.
I got the translation, so I think I understood perfectly what you said. The honor is mine. I'm really happy to be here for many reasons. Being an architect from, we were talking these days, from the other extreme of the Mediterranean, yeah? From the very far west in this case. But I had the feeling during these 2 days that there is a closer connection that I was expecting, a really close connection between your country and my country, or your culture and my culture, which is something that I have been appreciating in the last, these 2 very condensed days, with the help, of course, of George Sautashvili, who was a great student, I have to say, and I'm so happy to see, I'm so proud to see that he's now an assistant professor at this university, therefore also teaching to other young people as I used to do for many years. Yeah? Not only George, but also all his family and friends that were showing me with great intensity the city, the history, the cultural connections that made architecture at the end what I really believe it is, which is a cultural and artistic activity that influences so much our lives. So, saying that, I would like to talk today about, in a general way, buildings, projects in which we have been working in the last maybe 15 years or something. Some of them are built, some others I decided to bring projects that are not yet built because they are now in the process, so that also for students I think it's interesting to understand the way we have been working in these years, something that has to do with a whole culture about architecture that I think it has been so important in a country like Spain. I was talking in these 2 days in several occasions and of questions like this parallel, I would say, of what happened in Spain after a long dictatorship in 1975. Democracy came and suddenly the whole country changed and architecture became a key question. Actually, architecture represented of this transition to democracy, say in the last 40 years, but specifically in the last 25, represented a great asset of the Spanish culture. So thinking in this situation in Georgia, which is so, I could say, parallel with all the differences simply happening maybe 20 years after, I would really think that to transmit that architecture is a very important value and the connection between contemporary architecture and the memory of the historical past of a country and a city like Tbilisi in this case is a quite definitely important question. That's the reason today I wanted to show buildings that have to relate always to an idea that is connected to the place, to the site, or even to a memory that is my own interpretation. That's the reason I named this lecture Images and Thoughts, because in many cases, these thoughts that can be represented sometimes by an image is the trigger that makes the project start and the whole process become parts of this idea. What you are going to see is buildings in different countries, I have to say, because our career started and was for many years based in Spain, in Madrid, where we are from. But after, in the last 10 years, simply by these chances of life, I started to teach in Berlin. And therefore, to be also connected to this city that I love so much, as Madrid, I have to say, and where we have also a second office. So that means that now our work is divided in these 2 offices. We are 2 partners. And you are going to see projects that are done from Madrid or from Berlin, in Spain or in Germany, but also in other countries nowadays, which makes me understand architecture as a strong cultural sort of activity in which every project, and this is part of the idea, is somehow connected with another. The things that I'm going to show relate also to these images that I would like to refer as ideas that are thoughts. Images that somehow are the beginning of these projects, and in another way of looking at it, I would say that they represent that architecture is always the result of multiple circumstances that at the end resemble one another. Or, in other words, every project is a mirror of another one. Let me try to go directly to show you what I mean. Yeah? And I would like to start with this project. I don't know if you prefer to have the light softer or lower to see better the images or not. That depends on you. But I like to talk about this project that in a way became, if I have to say one really key project in our career, probably I would refer to this one. This is Madinat Al-Zahra Museum in Cordoba. Cordoba is this city in southern Spain that in the year 1000, so our history is also so long as the one I learned with you here, and so complex from different nations and cultures. Spain was under the Arab rule for 700 years, which is quite a long time, yeah? And in the year 1000, so 1000 years ago, this amazing city was built by at the time, Caliph of Cordoba, Abdurrahman III. It was a city that was built in the outskirts of the big city of Cordoba, and it was sort of a palace city, a place where the king was living with family and a power demonstration. The city disappeared in history, actually. It was demolished because of wars only 100 years after it was built. And it was recovered at the end of the 19th century, where the archaeologists started to work again. So when we entered this competition, and it was everything that I'm going to show today is a result of a competition. This is something we can talk also as a way of developing architecture. When we entered this competition like 15 years ago, 1998, this is 20 years ago, yeah. The idea from the very beginning was not to build in front of this impressive archaeological site, which is also the biggest and the most important in Spain. So how could we do a museum, as we were asked, and not building it? The idea came from the image that you saw before. The image is from an archaeological site that I visited with my students from Madrid many years ago, even before we did this competition, which is in Syria. And it somehow expressed this idea that became the leitmotif of the project. This idea that the project could be below Earth. And if it's below Earth, the project itself becomes a metaphor of the work of the archaeologists. So, put it in other words, instead of being architects, we play as if we were archaeologists, and therefore we find the museum below Earth. This is a model of the competition at the time. That means that the building, being almost completely below Earth, has only one facade, which is the roof. And after a long period of 10 years, working directly hand by hand with the archaeologists of this amazing Arab city, the building finally was finished. The building is a building almost like a matte building, almost like a land art intervention in the ground that you see only from the air, as you see here. That it plays with this idea that the archaeologists were, as they will be for many more years, working and finding the ruins of the Arab city of Rahman III, and we were working in parallel nearby, finding also our museum in the same way that they were finding theirs. So in a way, the project became all this process like a metaphor of the whole building process of the The building is itself like a double square, which is the dimension that the original city had. It is organized in patios. What you see here in orange color is the different courtyards that, like in old Arab architecture in Spain, organize sort of introverted spaces. When you see the building from the outside, you almost don't see it. And this is a key question, why we won the competition in a way, and eventually why this building became for us an important step, because it got this Aga Khan Award of Architecture and the Museum, European Museum of the Year, etc. But more than that, it was an experience of working with a strict limitation of concepts. If the whole Arab city was built only with stone that was stucco in white and red, for us, the building should also be done with only these two contemporary interpretation of the materials, which is white concrete, as you see there, and the red, which in this case is a Corten steel, which are the roofs or interior installation of the museum that we also did. But for me, it's more interesting to see this series of images, because I believe architecture is always connected to the memory of a place. It has not to be a direct sort of mimetic reinterpretation of the past. Actually, our building, as you see there, is absolutely, I would say, even abstract contemporary building. But nevertheless, each of these spaces of our museum somehow refer or echo or recall spaces of the Arab ruins of the archaeological site that you are going to visit after you have seen the museum. The project has only one facade. For me, at some point, and it was in this building and in some others that you will see, became clear that the roof is a very important part of a building. Usually the buildings forget the roof, especially modern architecture denied the roofs. We all know that Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus established that the roof could be only a flat element. Here it's flat, as you see, but in other buildings of us not. And it becomes a key question because it's the only way you really perceive it. So this building leads me to another of these images and ideas. Here in the Madinat Al-Zahra, this is the idea of the archaeological work, the one that triggered the project. The one that we're going to see now is another different building quite interesting also for us. The situation is very different in another part of Spain, and it was very much connected to the landscape and how we interpret the landscape of a place in which we had to extend an existing museum, which is the Museum of the City of San Sebastian. San Sebastian is, I don't know how many of you have been to Spain, and I will be a good seller of Spain today. But San Sebastian is probably the most beautiful city. It is in the north of Spain. It's in the Basque country, a Basque country that I learned that eventually has some connections with the deep culture of Georgia, as it is supposed. You see here the image of the city of San Sebastian. It is by the sea on the north of Spain. It's a quite different Spain from Cordoba, which is south and hot. San Sebastian is green and in a way Nordic for Spanish standards. And we had to work in the place that you see here, which is between the limit of the natural landscape that you see in the mountain over there. It's called Monte Urgul, the sea, of course, and the old city. Here we won the competition for the extension of the San Telmo Museum. In order to understand what is the museum is the cloister that you see in the model, the old church. This was a convent of the 16th century, 1550, and this convent, like many religious buildings, had many different uses in history, especially after the 19th century. So it became a museum in 1930s, in the First Spanish Republic. But since the 1930s, there had been not many real transformations. So the building was in somehow a bad state and needed a big extension. So we won the competition with the extension that you see there, an extension that is a very long building. It is like a very long wall that is inhabited inside. In other words, in our idea, the building deals with this limit between the natural landscape of the mountain and the urban landscape of the city. So working in this line became the theme of how to develop this very long building but very narrow building. These are models that we were working, we have been using. We work with very large models also in our office. And in the model from the very beginning, it became clear that in this case, the skin of the building, the outer limit, was the key question. How to develop the skin? We asked two very good friends and artists from the Basque country, Ferran Otero, to develop together the texture of the exterior facade. The facade came from walking with them through the landscape of the border of the Basque country on San Sebastian, where you see these images, for example, these stones that after centuries have been eroded by the water, by the wind, and sometimes the green, as you see, is coming from inside. So we designed a whole facade that is based on a series of modules. These modules that you see there, too, are 1 meter 80 times 60 centimeters, so like 3 squares. And we develop a series of different perforations so that in some cases, the green can come through the perforations in a not very different way from the natural situation that happens there, because the whole project is dealing with this idea of the limit between what is artificial and what's natural. So the project, once it was finished, as you see in the image, not only refers to this mountain, it refers also to the military constructions of the 17th century over there, when it doesn't work. And when you are coming closer, then you understand that this very sculptural image gets a different texture simply because of these systems of perforations. We have 4 different types of perforations with more, less, and less perforations, and they can be organized in different positions, rotating the building in different situations. The inside, again, is one single material, is the white concrete again, where we build walls, roofs, slabs, everything. And with this other important question for us in our architecture, which is these spaces in between, that you see in between the wall, bringing the natural light from above, and establishing again, like I tried to show in the project of the archaeological site before, this connection between a contemporary building that we are doing and the historical building that we restored. So that what you see on the left image is always the historical comment in which we did sort of very respectful restoration when everything was simply taking into the detail of how to clean the stone or the stuccos or to repair. When we had to introduce some new elements, for example, like a stair, or then there's this tension that we always like to establish between what is existing and what is new. And the building itself, being in the plaza of the museum, becomes an art installation in the city that you see here during the night, but also a very lively public space. I think one of the key questions that we try to transmit in our projects is not only what the client wants, which is a museum or is a hotel or is it whatever, but also what they don't necessarily ask to do, which is a public space. So when you see our building here, the building is a building that you can also cross with the stairs and then go up to the mountain. It became a very lively plaza in San Sebastian. You have to see that the situation is amazing, yeah? With the historical buildings, with the mountain, with the sea. And it's a place that nowadays, especially because last year it was San Sebastian was a European capital, cultural capital of the year. It became a very special place in the city. But it started, as I mentioned, with this intervention together with this artist. Let me go to another project that we did in quite different place, in this case in Austria, and show it very briefly because it's also a museum extension. It's in the city of Graz. Actually, Graz is also a World Heritage City. And it's a World Heritage City protected by UNESCO in all the center of the city, not for many reasons, for the buildings, for the plazas, for the streets, also for the roofs of the city that are beautiful. In this case, we entered this competition to extend the Joanneum. Joanneum is a museum institution in Graz, which is the second most important in Austria. The first one are the Vienna museums, of course. The second is this Joanneum that owns many different buildings. And in this case, you see this interstitial space between three buildings. One is a history museum, the other one is the library of the city, the public library, the other one is the art museum. They were asking for a new extension for all these elements that a museum needs, like entrance, public hall, lecture hall, cafeteria, part of the archives, etc. So, and we went with this idea. The idea that, again, we should not build above, we simply should build below. Therefore, the ground becomes the protagonist. The new plaza that was closed now becomes the public plaza where you enter the museum, but not necessarily only that, the public plaza where you can stay and live. If you see the section over there, you see the two historical buildings that we also restored, again, simply being very respectful and without adding almost nothing new. And the new extension, which is below ground, you see in the model below, it's organized with a series of courtyards again, or patios. Imagine a huge cone, and this cone is cut in different sections, and they are put into the ground with a certain intention and situation, and so they bring the light inside to this below ground space. In this case, it's a different variation of what we did in the Cordoba archaeological site, because these conical elements, they reflect not only the light, but they reflect, as you might see in the image, also the historical buildings behind, so that when you are below in the library, on the lecture hall, you are also seeing in a sort of surrealistic way the reflection of the buildings that are behind. And also the building, in a way, becomes the illumination of this new plaza in the city of Graz. And again, it has become a very lively place besides the museum. So the plaza has its own life for public events, etc., etc. So the building, or this image that I show here, this is one of these famous rotor reliefs by Marcel Duchamp, because it really concentrates very much this idea that with one single element that is repeated several times, you can achieve the complexity of architecture. That would be another theme of our way of thinking in architecture, that complexity can achieve by means of using simply a couple of elements and repeating them in different ways. That's the reason Marcel Duchamp, that you see in this famous image again here, became also one of these images that are thoughts. Yeah? This is an image where he is repeating himself, playing chess with himself. Yeah? But it helps me to transmit to you another different type of building that was also, I would say, an important one in our career because it opened many others. It was a building which is a temporary market, and this case is in Madrid, in my city. But it was a consequence of another competition that we won for a very large market. That is not the one I'm going to show today. This is the one you see here. It is a market, it's a library, it's a sports center, it's a very complex building, the very center of Madrid, that acts as this relation of three containers with this white glass material that at the end reflects these urban situations. But I'm not interested so much now in showing you that, but in the temporary one. Because during the time we had to build this market, of course, the marketplaces, I mean, the people that sell the products had no place. So after winning the competition, the city asked us to do a temporary place that was supposed to be for 2 years. And reality of the construction and even the crisis that came made it for 4 years. But in any case, it was a temporary place. And when they were asking us to do, let's say, like a big tent in order to put together the people working there for a couple of years, we thought it was a very interesting opportunity to develop another idea, which is the one you might see there in the plaza nearby. You see a series of pentagons, a series of polygonal elements. We thought that it was a very interesting thing to develop this idea of the traditional markets in the plaza, where you have the pavilions and people sell their spaces, but in a very contemporary and also abstract way. We thought that if we develop this pavilion, which is a pentagon, which is not such a common element to work in architecture, and this pentagon is repeated, say, 3 times exactly, and then we have a bigger one, and we repeat it also 3 times. So we achieve a sort of combination, a combinatorial thinking, which is very important as a concept for us in architecture, in which you can achieve complexity by means of developing only very simple details of one single piece. The question is that each of these pavilions have also an inclinated roof. And here I mention again the idea that the roof is important in the building. So that when you rotate them, as you see in the image, every roof, the whole ensemble appears to be in a constant variation, even though it's built almost with a single element. The space in between is the one that you see here. We use these translucent materials because we thought it was going to be only for some time. It was going to be demolished after some time. The spaces to sell inside were done very simply with this structural steel construction and this polycarbonate. And the building itself became, in a way, during the time it was built in the center of Madrid, really also an art installation, a public space. It became a very popular place also because it became like this sort of lantern in the city. So for us, this was a very important project, even though it was a more modest question. Yeah? Actually, as you see there, sadly for us, but it was already thought, the building was demolished when the other big market was finished, and now they built the plaza that was there. But for us, this building became, in a way, a sort of a mock-up or a model of other ideas. For example, at the same time, we won this, for us, rather unusual thing, because we were basically in public cultural buildings, but this was a competition we won in Munich for a master plan for office buildings in the outskirts of Munich. So, as you see, the project was conceived almost the same way as a series of variation of the same piece. The only thing is that it's a much bigger scale. So the same single building with different heights and with different inclination became the buildings that we are now finishing in construction. I mean, not finishing, but soon in construction in the city of Munich. Or again, another project that I'm going to show a little bit later, this museum in the city of Lugo in Spain, can be considered as a variation of one single element. In this case, this is cylinder, sort of positive or negative, or the competition that we won in China, now at quite different place, for a very large science museum, is again variation of the same single element, or the museum that we built, the Contemporary Art Center in Cordoba, again there are variations of one single element, in this case the hexagonal plan. Let me see this idea that we are coming back and forth in different moments, because in this project it became also a key question for us. This is a contemporary art center in the same city of Cordoba, where we built the archaeological museum. We have been working in this beautiful city for several years in this old Arab city. But in this case, we had the chance, we were invited to work in this very center of the city, in front of the old city of Cordoba, that was at the time the most important city in Western Europe, because it was the very deep medieval times when the rest of Europe was in decay, but the Arab culture was in a high level. Yeah? So high level that we are working nearby one of these buildings that for me is probably the most interesting building in Spain, which is the Mosque of Cordoba, which is not anymore the mosque, it is the Cathedral of Cordoba, but still has the whole structure that the Arabs did at that time. It is a very large building that achieves this complexity by means of repeating always the same element, which is this famous double arch that you see, and creates this sort of very contemporary isotropic space that can expand in all the dimensions. Yeah? That was a key point. How could we do a very contemporary art center for video art, digital art, and nevertheless being so close to the culture of this Hispano-Muslim Muslim culture? We were also very interested in these geometries. These geometries that are ornamental, but they hide this spirit of this combinatorial thinking. So if you spend a couple of minutes, you understand that the laws of this, patterns is rather simple, variation, rotations, etc. Or these mukarnas that are in Cordoba, in Granada, in the north of Morocco, for example, in Marrakesh. So we thought, is it possible to develop a contemporary art center with this architectural concept? This is how we want the competition. This is the model of the competition. So we developed this idea of a series of polygonal spaces that appear to be random, but if you look at them, are very simple. Imagine a very simple regular hexagon that we divide in 3 rooms of 90, 60, and 120 square meters. And when we make rotations or symmetries, I mean, this is like a game. And at the end, the project becomes a non-hierarchical space of spaces that you can cross that create a sequence of exhibition spaces with this geometrical pattern, and then spaces for artists in residence and for common spaces, mediatek, etc. So if you look to the section of the building, the section expresses the whole idea, yeah? This sort of inverted space that we built in the working models that we did in our office so often, and that recall these mukarnas, masharabiyas of this Arab art. So this was a model that we won the competition. This was a model we developed later in which the whole facade becomes a special treatment for the use of the artists, of video artists inside. The building was built rather quickly and becomes this expression that the roof, as I mentioned before, is a key element that expresses the section, the natural light, and therefore the space inside. When you see the building from the other side of the river Guadalquivir, you see a very horizontal building, and when you see it from behind, you see the space that is going to be used by the artists in residence. But the whole building is conceived inside. Outside is this white building, GRC, glass reinforced concrete building. But inside, the whole building is like a factory. The whole building is built in concrete. The whole building expresses this idea of having this inverted, almost very large scale muqarnas. They create these hexagonal spaces that can be connected one with another, which are the exhibition spaces that are sometimes very compressed spaces, as you see there, sometimes very expanded. I mean, a single simple plan, it creates many different situations. Important for us, and in this case is always, of course, the natural light and how the natural light can be controlled in a building that one has to understand that this is not a museum. For a museum, this building could never work. It is an art center where it is produced the art for workshops, for performances. It's not an art that is exhibited and kept in that place. And it reacts to this idea that this sequence of patios that you saw before are incorporated into this vision of the building that starts from the roof. In a way, in Spain we say this, never start the house by the roof, but we start the house by the roof in many cases. And actually, you see here, for example, this is not allowed because the roof is simply the top of the building. But we were here with all the people from my office. And in a way, we have this situation in which the roof explains the whole building. Now the building is finally in use because the economical crisis delayed it. But the building is used for performances, it's used for workshops, it's used for theater and dance, and of course also contemporary art exhibitions. And any other intervention that is very much linked to a very lively place that is connecting the city, the neighborhood, the young artists, and the production and exhibition of art. The outside of the building became a theme for us. As you saw probably in the image behind, there was this pattern. This pattern is a way of reducing the whole idea of the project to the facade. We developed with a group from Berlin that did the Kunsthaus in Graz, this media facade, this facade that is done by each of these elements that you see here is a pixel. This pixel has these LED lamps. These LED lamps are connected, of course, to a specific program that can be activated by the artist. And then the building has this different situation that during the day appears as you see there. During the night, it can be and is transformed into different situations that have to do with whatever artistic installation is done by the artists themselves. So in a way, it is a way of expressing this idea that the materiality of the building becomes also a consequence of the idea. Something that in some projects, like the one I'm going to show you now, deals with a very different scale. As you see here, we are talking about a museum in China. This for us is a big change. No? Not something that we were necessarily looking for, but we received the invitation to participate in a limited competition in China with other international architects for the Science Museum. So for us it's a challenge that we wanted to work and think of it, and then and therefore we were interested and we visited the place. The place is Guangzhou. If you see Guangzhou is the old canton, what we call canton, and it's so well known by Cantonese food and so on. But more interesting for us to understand that what the city of Guangzhou, together with the city of Shenzhen, which is in the middle, together with the city of Hong Kong, which is so well known, the three together make 45 million people. So the same as Spain, the whole country. Yeah? So 45 million people live in this one single city, which is divided in three. Yeah? This was the first question about scale, which is a theme that was always behind the idea we developed. Actually, the place is in the area that you see here, near the Pearl River Delta. It is in this axis that belongs to this concept that is very Chinese of working with axis, because this axis of the new city is parallel to the axis of the old canton. We always like to try to interpret the place and the site and to see our own personal interpretation. So we love these plans. Of course, this is an abstraction, but it's a beautiful plan, I think, of the 18th century canton, yeah, when you see the axis that is always there. And you see also this repetition of one single element of the houses, yeah, something that you perceive also in all these old images of the old canton with the axis that now is transformed into the axis of the new tower of the TV, where all the new buildings are being built in the area. But more than that, we were interested in visiting these neighborhoods that in many cases are being destroyed in the old city, sadly, yeah? Because they have a beautiful architectural conception that had to do and that interested us very much with this idea that I'm mentioning, that it is variations of one single element. Each of these houses with these spaces in between that you see have different roofs or have different architectural features, but they create this sort of uniform unity. So we started with this image, which is this thought of this is a base of one of these dynasties in Ming in China, a beautiful ceramic element. And we thought, why shouldn't, the only way would eventually can control a building so far away, so bigger, so much bigger than we are used to do and so on, would be, why don't we define one single element? This single element would be also cladded with this white ceramic, like the old porcelain of China. And then we would repeat it, repeating this element in these 9 cubes with different roofs, and then again the roof becomes a theme, creates all these variations that apparently are different, but at the end are coming from the single element. In other words, if we are able to define and detail very much one single of these large cubes, we would be eventually able to control the whole building. And this is a process in which we are working, and we started the roofs that connect to this image of the beautiful artistic interpretation of the landscape in China, but also a very systematic and rational building, simply 9 cubes for the Dutch Museum. It is a little bit more than 9 cubes, because when you see the section in China, things are large, and we needed to somehow transmit the public space outside to the inside. So the key idea is that the center cubes, as you see there, are floating. Actually, nothing floats, but it can be solved with engineering solutions. So it's really like 3 very large bridges. These bridges of 60 meters long are hanging and therefore creating a complete open space in the ground floor. So that when you see the building in the process, the plan is like a container. In this case, the interior is going to be a science museum with no light, done by some Chinese company. In this case, not by us. So, but the roof is the only element, as you see there, that creates this variation with these gardens on top of it. The ground floor becomes this very large common space that exterior and interior is connecting, whereas the outside becomes this expression of the building, which is variation of this combinatorial thinking. We won this competition like almost 2 years ago. We were working very strongly, in this case in the office in Berlin, with all type of models, developing the whole structure. The project has stopped for the last 6 months. That means that it hasn't started construction. I don't know if it's going to build or not, because sincerely we don't get exactly from the Chinese clients if it's going to happen or not, but till now it's a quite interesting experience of trying to adapt our way of thinking to a complete different situation in a different country, a different scale of this museum building. Let me go to another building, which is, again, the scale of the places we have been working the last years, in this case in Spain. This is Lugo. Lugo is a small, beautiful town in northwestern Spain. It's in a region called Galicia. You know, Spain is very complex, like you, and I see in your history, because Spain is relatively small, but has different languages, different cultures. There's Catalonia, there is Basque Country, there is, in this case, Galicia, and Galicia has its own language. It's very connected to Portugal. It's in north of Portugal. And there we were invited to this competition for a museum, the Museum of History of Lugo. Lugo has an impressive Roman wall. The Roman walls that you see here are the best kept in Spain, and so they are defined by these cylinders that are very strong. Besides, the building where we had to do this sort of visitor center for the history of Lugo was an old industrial center. They had these silos that were demolished some years ago. This silo is one that is well known. It's not there. It's one of the photographs of Bern and Hilda Becher, the famous German photographs. But for us, the idea of the cylinder became the beginning of the whole project. And the whole project was developed, as you see here, by defining, again, like the China idea and so on, one single element. The single element is this sort of almost industrial cylinder. The projects that I'm showing you today, even though very different in sort of even materials and even shapes, they all relate to this fact, this idea that there is always a thought that becomes an image that in a way leads the whole process. This is sometimes in our way of working that is always through competitions, and therefore in many different cities or different places, sometimes is chance. For example, this is a museum that you have seen in Lugo. And 2 or 3 years later, we were invited. When I say invited, it's not always invited. Sometimes in Germany, for example, you apply to get into a competition, and they select a number of offices. They select us to do an extension of the archaeological museum in Munich. And we were shocked to see that this building is protected. It's a building of 1968 or something. In Germany, there is now a strong protection of buildings of the 1960s, 70s, or even 50s, because they represent the German democracy after the Second World War, and this architecture has a value, so that they are very protected. And so we were intrigued by this idea that this building that in a way resembled our own building, done in the 1960s by an architect called von Berth, played with some of the same ideas. They were built in Corten, but they were cubes, and the whole building was this sequence in this area of center of Munich, in which you see there are 6 cubes. And these 6 cubes are the exhibition spaces of this archaeological museum, and then the rest of the building was for the offices, workshops, administration, etc. So the competition was actually only asking for the whole refurbishment of the project and keeping the quality of the existing 1960s building and the extension. The extension was proposed by us, what you see here, simply by going below ground. You know that it's a theme that comes back and forth in our work in many cases. So we extended the museum for this temporary exhibition below ground. Only some elements appear outside to bring the light, to reorganize the spaces, to have a new garden. So the whole project is now in the process. I'm showing you today projects that are built years ago with others that are now in the boards or in the computers. No? The project just started construction. It is extending, as you see there in this area, the whole area below ground. If you see the section brings a new stair, and the new stair with the exhibition spaces. Building in Germany is different as building in Spain. For example, in Spain there is a lot of freedom about proposing things. In Germany, not so much. But on the other hand, they get extreme quality. So when you see, for example, this idea of the roof, it's going to be a seen concrete roof for these exhibition spaces. There will be new connection elements, and there will be these skylights and new gardens outside that bring the light into the space below. But I bring it here for this strange connection that sometimes the project have. As I said, every project in a way is a mirror of another one. And also to show our attitude, and in some cases is really expressing a very strong architectural position, but in some others is taking a step forward because there is already an existing historical or more recent building, and therefore simply adding what we think is necessary or what is necessary and keeping the rest of the building in the way it was. A very recent competition we won in Madrid. You see that we are architects from Madrid, but we don't have that much work in Madrid. Our work is in many other places. But now we won a competition for a very interesting museum. It is a very recent one. which is a Museo Sorolla. Sorolla is this very great and recognized painter of the century in Spain. Is sort of, to simplify it very much, it would be a Spanish impressionist. Not exactly, but it's a painter from Valencia with a lot of presence of light. You see some of the images of his paintings. He's an extremely recognized painter in Spain who has this museum. The image of him painting over there is because it's a museum that was his own house in the early 20th century. So his own house is a house museum, which is a very interesting type of museum, which is different from others, which is a building. The house is a beauty in the center of Madrid. It's like a sort of oasis in the middle of the streets where you have these beautiful gardens, very, very tiny, very small, but it is, of course, as you can imagine, absolutely protected from the heritage point of view. So the competition was asking for an extension of this building. This is Madrid. Madrid is a very urban, dense city like Barcelona, not with such a beautiful master plan as Barcelona, because Barcelona has a perfect master plan of Cerdà. Madrid has not, but has the same type of, urban blocks with patios inside. So in this block that you see there, this house of Sorolla, that in the early 20th century was, of course, another type of city, is now in the middle of the blocks. But the museum, the foundation, finally bought this space that you see behind. So the space behind is nowadays simply a garage of the house that is behind. So, but finally, gaining this space was very important because the building absolutely needs all the spaces for temporary exhibition, for auditorium, for the workshop, for the atelier, for storage, cafe, etc., etc. So what you see here is our intervention with our idea that won the competition. You see here the Sorolla Museum, this house with the beautiful gardens as it is. And this is the area that extends the building behind. So the extension is not going to be seen from the front. But how came the idea is very much like establishing this dialogue or this conversation with the existing building. The existing building has two key features besides the gardens. It has the patio, the green patio that you see there, and more than other things, it has the atelier of the painter, the one that you saw in the first image, which is a sort of house-like structure. So our proposal came from what you see there. We will have another small patio and a sequence of ateliers, so to say, which are the temporary exhibitions. So you see here the space, the extension area, the existing patio and the new one, and the existing atelier that is going to be kept as it is and restored, of course, and the new sequence of exhibition spaces that, if you see in section, somehow recall this idea that the only thing we had to do is to try to read what's there and extend the concept in a way. I show it here because it's very recent. We only started with the basic project. This is the working models that we always use. There's a view of the building that again takes this idea of taking a step backwards, because the protagonist is not our building. The protagonist is the house of Sorolla. There will be only a new entrance from this ex-garage that now is going to be the entrance to the public area. And the new extension is going to have, of course, this sequence of more neutral spaces that nevertheless have the shape of this atelier that for us recalls this image, that is the thought that started the project. Let me go in this quick way of showing you many ways of acting to a different building that nevertheless has to do with this roof type conception of architecture. We won 1 year ago a competition in France. It's the first time we were working there. It's again a different, every country is different, and not only in culture, but also in the way they work in architecture, in construction, etc. But we entered this competition for, it's really a sports center and a cultural center of a not very large town, a small town called Reniers, which is only, say, 20 kilometers away from Geneva, so it's very close to Switzerland. Actually, in this town, what people do is they work in Switzerland, they make more money, but they live in France, which is not so expensive. And so it's a town that is doing very well and has this situation that you see in the image in the pre-Alps. So the Alps are in the distance, not so far away, in a very well-organized city, and in this space where the proposal was to do this sports center that basically is dedicated to tennis, sports hall, and a cultural space like an auditorium for exhibitions and use of the community. We won the competition with a very simple scheme that makes that the plan is very rational and logical. It's organized in the spaces they needed with a limited budget. But again, the roof was the key question, not only because it somehow may recall the idea that the Alps are behind, but also because this idea that each type of different areas of the roof will express the different parts of this program. So when you look to the plan is, as I said, very straightforward, with these conditions of natural light inside, with the organization of the tennis courts or the sports area or the auditorium that you see on one side. Let's say very functional, logical plan. The section nevertheless expresses this sort of zigzag of elements that are very compressed or very expanded, that organize the interior spaces, but moreover they create this idea that a very simple building has all the power of the architectural idea in the roof again, yeah? And that it somehow recalls the presence of the Alps behind. Because all the projects are connected for a strange reason that I don't know. This image of the Alps that was more or less parallel in the same year to the invitation we received for this, for us, very interesting competition, which is the museum and exhibition center for Mont Blanc. Mont Blanc, probably many of you know, because it's this very famous company for pens. Yeah? I don't know you, but I was convinced that Mont Blanc was French or Swiss, but no, Mont Blanc is German, like things, many other sort of very technical things. So Mont Blanc is a company that was founded 100 years ago, more than that, in Hamburg. And Hamburg is a very interesting city in Germany, as you know, an industrial city with an amazing harbor and so on, but also with an industrial area which is called Altona. Altona is this neighborhood that you see over there, which is the factory of Mont Blanc. Yeah? In this factory of Mont Blanc, they have been building this, creating these beautiful and technical and artistic objects that started, as I mentioned, like 100 years ago, and eventually became sort of the masterpiece of these elements. Actually, their most famous pen is called Meisterstück, which is the one you see over there, the one in the middle. The one below is a more modern example. Yeah? So when we entered the competition, this was a specially invited competition for 6 architects from different parts of the world, and then they asked us to do for the factory that you see there, the new extension, but it's not an extension of the factory, it's a new building. So we were completely free of whatever dimension, shape we wanted to do, but they were very interested, of course, in the image and the identity of the company in the building. So this is the factory of Mont Blanc. This is the area of a parking that is in front that it was given for the competition. And our response was, if we are to build a new building, why not to do something else? First of all, not only doing this exhibition center museum that they want, of course, but also creating a new sort of facade or image of the whole factory to the city. And even more, creating also this public space in front of it. So what you see here is what we were given, and this is our proposal, which was the winning proposal with, again, an idea that there's a thought about the concept of what is this company. It is a very long building, as you see here. It's 100 meters long, thin, black building. Why is long, thin, black, longitudinal? Is because, of course, if you buy one of these elements, or you receive a present from your friend or family or wife, then you will get the case. And the case is always a black case in Mont Blanc. And then when you open the case, then you find the object. And if you are even more curious and open the object, then you find absolutely the exact precision and beauty of this very elegant engineering that is inside. So that was the whole idea of that we presented. So we said, okay, we're going to do a project, a building that is a case. This case is black because it's your color. When you open it, then there will be there will be this section that is a complex building. This simplicity outside makes a complex section inside that recalls this idea that we wanted to tell. So when you see the plans are rather simple and logical again, like in many of our projects. Basically the ground floor is the reception area, there's a shop, there is a cafeteria and restaurant, etc. The intermediate floor is all exhibition on 3 different types. So there will be an exhibition of their products, I mean their pens, the history of the company, etc. On the left side there will be an art exhibition because they own an art, contemporary art Rented collection, and then the one on the right is going to be temporary exhibitions or whatever they are interested in. And the upper floor is for sort of academy, presentation of products, etc., etc. As we do very often, we work on models. The model evolved in different ways and different dimensions. We are now developing the whole system of spaces, like this sort of floating world that we have in between, and the exhibition areas of these 3 different types of exhibition, of contemporary art, of the company products, and also the public area that in all our projects become something that we are not asked to do, but becomes, in this case, with a reflection of a pond, the image of the building. Another project, another parallel project for us is the whole conception of the facade, because it's a black box, but it's a black box, as you see here in these images, that in one way, first of all, recalls 2 references. One is that when you draw with the pens, there are always this sort of fluent texture of the ink. On the other hand, of course, it's also the Mont Blanc, that for them was so important, the Mont Blanc as a mountain. So what you see in these images is the treatment of these different layers that we are developing now in detail, in mock-ups, in models, in the office, in this case in the office in Berlin, that can be also used for projections, as you see. Now, because this is Germany, different from Spain, in this case, the building will start construction next year, but they are already building the model of the facade to see how it works. So what you see there is already the mock-up of the facade. You see two different variations, because we are starting one in simply black concrete, and the other one is in carbon fiber concrete, which is much lighter and achieves a more black image that you see there. So these are photos for only last week, in which we were simply testing also possibilities of the lighting elements, etc., etc. But it's simply to explain a process that is so different, like it's in every different country. But more important for me is to show you this image. I think we won the competition because of this. We made a model. The model was exactly this dimension, like a pen. So we gave the model to the president of the company, and then when you open the model, then you see the complexity of this building inside. Yeah. This is also to say that in many cases architecture deals very much with this transmission of an idea, which is also a story, specifically with this type of client. Yeah. Also with this idea that sometimes a very simple building expresses the whole, or a very simple volume can express this quality. And this leads me to talk about 2 other projects that can be defined by this presence of this single element inside an existing building. Let me talk before about this one, because this is another, for us, key project in our career. This is the reason we are in Germany, in a way, because like 10 years ago, we entered this competition for a new extension of an existing museum in the city of Halle. Halle is 1 hour and a half south of Berlin. It's a historical university city, and there is this impressive historical building, which is a Moritzburg, which is a Schloss. I mean, this is a castle, a palace, a castle, more than that, that belonged to was built by the Bishop of Brandenburg. So that was built in the 15th century. The building was a great important, at the time the bishops were so military as religious, so it was a military and religious building. But in the course of history, in the so-called War of the 30 Years in the 17th century, the Swedish destroyed 2 wings of the castle. So what you see in this image, which is not so far away, only 100 years ago, there is the building as it was for 300 years, which is a ruin. Actually, in the city of Halle, it was called the Ruine in German, so the ruin. People call it the ruin, yeah? Because 2 wings were already museum since the 1930s, but the other 2 were, as we saw them when we entered the competition, so simply the walls, yeah? But for us, the ruin had to be, in a way, presence, because it was so deeply connected to the history of the place. But also the roofs, because the roofs of the city of Halle are on the castle itself, these very steep roofs that in Spain, being an architect from southern Europe, I mean, roofs are not so, tend to be flat in many cases, but in Germany, really very steep. This is, for example, the central church of the city, that it was very interestingly painted by Feininger. Feininger is this great expressionist German painter who was living in Halle, in this castle, and he has his atelier. Feininger is the architect who painted the first Bauhaus poster, if you remember, and has these famous Halle paintings of the city of Halle that are part of the main collection of the museum. So what was our approach? This project that we did at the time from Madrid, and we had no connection to Germany, was, well, let's do only 1 roof on top of these ruins. And this roof, this is the model of the competition, would be a metal, very abstract roof, but nevertheless, it somehow connects or establishes this dialogue with the historical roofs of the other part of the castle in a very contemporary way, and it will be hanging, as you see in the sketch, and therefore the ruin will be without columns, completely free, and another tower will appear in the place where the old tower one day was destroyed. So what you see here is the project as it was built, with these hanging new spaces that are, in order to make it look so simple, you can imagine there's a very strong structural intervention above, yeah? But we wanted to make it light and floating, and also expressing this importance that I mentioned in some cases of the space in between. It's how the historical ruin, the new spaces, create these very tension spaces, whereas the new boxes include the new exhibition spaces of the museum. More important for us is to understand it from at the outside, yeah, to see how the ruin, the building, the old castle somehow expresses this idea that belongs to the earth, that it's heavy, that is history, that is memory, whereas the roof expresses this idea that is light, that is new, that one day eventually will be demolished, and nevertheless the museum will still there, yeah, as it was, and expresses also, again you see my office on top of the not legal situation of going up, it expresses this idea that the roof was the origin of this project. Actually, like with the pass of the time, they sent me this photo recently because the building somehow expresses very well this idea that is like separated from the existing one. It is light, you could take it away as we did with the model, even with the past of the different stations, for example in winter, the very somehow, and George knows, winters in Berlin, and that can be very cold and snowy, or even the presence of the river in front. I mean, it's a very contemporary intervention. It's a very clear, modern project, but nevertheless, has its roots in this idea. It has its roots in the roofs of the city, in the ruin, in the drawings of Feininger that for us were so challenging. This project is connected to the last one we won. This we won only 1 month ago. This is in Dresden, a very important historical city in Germany, also important because of the really difficult history. As you know, Dresden was completely destroyed in the Second World War in one of the strongest bombings. In this case, there was this competition of this man who is a private collector, Italian and German. He's called Mazzona. This man has been collected avant-garde material in the last 50 years. So he has an incredible collection of documents, paintings, drawings, photographs, magazines, books that are now together in different places. He has also furniture of the 1920s. He collects everything which is an avant-garde of the 20th century. Surrealism, constructivism, neoplasticism, in painting, also in writing, also in music. So it's an amazing collection. So he got to an agreement with the government of this land in Germany, in Dresden, that gave him one building so that he brings the collection to the city. This building is in the very center of this historical city of Dresden, on the other side of the famous castle and church and opera, etc. It was a building that was started to be built in the 18th century. As you see in this image, it was to be two parallel buildings, two symmetrical buildings for the sort of ward of the city. At the end, it was only one built. And the building has a long history, as you can imagine. It had many uses. This was just before the Second World War, when it was used for some public uses. And of course, like everything in many places of Europe, and definitely in Germany, it was very, very strongly damaged. So all the interior was disappeared. So during the DDR, the socialist communist times, it was rebuilt and used for some public uses. And nowadays, it's going to be completely transformed. The only value, the only strong value is the exterior. The exterior is kept, even though they reconstructed the roof, but the interior not. So in our competition entry, we thought it was so important to achieve a very flexible ground floor and to transmit this idea that this is a project between memory and avant-garde, because it's a collection of the avant-garde, but it's the memory of the place in all the senses. So I do like this because the whole project started with this idea that we are simply adding what you see here in black, which is really the core of the collection, which is the archive. So the archive is going to be hanging, floating in the center of the building for several reasons. One is this metaphor of the memory and the avant-garde. The other one is a very pragmatical one, that this is a river Elbe, and the Elbe, and in some cases, is really high. Actually, 10 years ago, there were terrible floods. So it's not very smart to have the archive below ground. So we want with this idea that you see that the ground floor is almost free, can be used in different ways for lectures, for temporary exhibitions. Then there is a ring of the area of the people working in the archive. And if you see it in section, the archive is in the very center, so that in the very moment you are working there, everything is related to the archive. The project has been conceived as this concrete house. I mean, this concrete house within a house, which is a challenge, because at the end it's going to be a heavy structural intervention in order to leave completely free this space of this 18th century building. And this has to do with how this space in between, as you see, and the intervention of a single gesture can give the whole meaning to the project. And leads me to connect it to a project we are about to start construction now in Munich, which is this hotel. You see that buildings, we are working in different type of buildings because of this consequence of competition. And in this case, it's a private client, but it's a public competition that was organized by the city of Munich, because and this is an interesting thing maybe to talk, because I was talking these days about how private clients, in principle, they want to do the more they can. It's a normal thing, but then there has to be the city and the norms, the ones that really balance how. No? So the private client owns this 5-star hotel in the center of Munich. 5-star hotel, but you look at the facade and the building, and it's really a rather ugly building, and the client knows it. Yeah? So the reason, the idea is he wanted to extend this building to gain more floors, to gain more rooms, and to do a completely new building. But the city said this can be possible only if you do a competition, and we decide which architects are invited, and then there's a public jury, and then whoever wins. And this is the reason we are working with them now. This building is so as it is now, but it had better times. You know? And that was before the Second World War. Of course, the building was, as you see here, it is in the center of Munich. For those who know Munich, it's in the Karl store, which is one of the entrance of the city. You see that it's in the front of it. Of course, I show these images because in Germany there's always the presence of what happened in the war. No? It was demolished, and after the war they rebuilt this new building that you see here. This is Munich, this is a center. You see that the Altstadt, the old city, is almost a perfect circle. There's a pedestrian area, and in front of the pedestrian area this is this gate of the city. It was interesting, as you see, that we like to try to look to history, understand what happened before, that this red dot, it was a cube that was built already in the 18th century. It was a house of a family, yeah, that had this connection that you see there is a very much in the axis. Being in the axis means another theme in architecture, which is frontality, which is not common in contemporary architecture, which is always about breaking the frontality. But in this case, we were shocked when we went to the place, and then we went to walking, and we saw that this ugly building suddenly has an incredible presence in the city. Because you walk and you see there, and suddenly this building is like an extremely prominent position with this access situation. Yeah? So we thought that the project had to do, the new building that we were asked to develop for this new hotel had to do with this presence of this frontal image that you see here. We also thought that the public space that is in front, not so big, should somehow also be connected to the interior, so that even if it's a hotel, and in this case a luxury hotel, and in this case a private place, it should somehow recall this public condition. So in other words, we were working with this idea of the void. Imagine this yellow element is like carving the space inside. Carving the space inside means creating a lobby of 30 meters high, which we, after when the competition developed in the models that you see here, is like having a really dramatic space inside, compressed and expanded, whereas the rest of the building, of course, are these rooms that the building has. I show these images that are thoughts because, of course, I'm an architect from Spain, and I think being an architect in Spain and not a contemporary architect and not being somehow influenced by this great artist, which is Chillida, is difficult. Chillida is one of the greatest sculptors of the latest 20th century in Spain, and he always worked with this area of the space in between, the carving spaces. So this became the idea that we developed eventually, as you see in the project after winning it. This was still the competition images, and then now the project in development and in detail. The project is being detailed to the extreme in the German system of to the last detail before starting construction, and then at the end of beginning of next year, one day construction will start, and apparently everything should be very quick. But for us, it was important to connect it to this idea that sometimes these images that I refer come from the site to the place, sometimes they come from my own or our own personal memory and background. Yeah? Working with this carving folding, which is a way I teach in the university in Berlin, in the first year students, because there are manual actions that refer to thoughts, is connected also to this building in Bristol. Here we won the competition in a British city, in Bristol, in England. Yeah? If we were invited not invited, if in this case the building in Munich was because the building was very ugly and then the client wanted to do a much better one, besides bigger, here we literally were invited, they invited 4 architects and 4 artists in order to do only one part of a building, which is a facade, because they said that this is the ugliest building in, at least as you see there, in Bristol. But many people said in Britain, in the newspapers, which we simply didn't understand very well. But we were invited, so we entered the competition, we passed to the second phase, and at the end we were only 3 for this final situation that had to do with doing a new facade for a building that had already many additions, as you see here. This is Bristol, this is very close to Wales, and it was an old historical important harbour, as you probably know. Now it's a city growing, and with the complexity of all the hospitals. You see that this is a hospital of the city. It was built, the first phase, at the beginning of the 20th century with a rather austere but somehow elegant building that you see there and is still there. Then it was extended in the 1960s with this building that they said it was so ugly. And we couldn't understand why they say it was so ugly, because I think it's a rather straightforward building. It's true, it's a brutalist building made of concrete, and it's true that the building had a very bad maintenance. The building had asbestos, they added things for the air conditioning, all the windows were changed, and even though they built this green thing only 2 years before, so it was like having all sort of added difficulties. But we were, I think, the only architects of the invited that said that this is not ugly. Actually, it has to be somehow updated, but the idea of the whole rhythm should be kept. So we went with this idea that relates to this idea of folding with material. It is like this is the facade. They ask us to do a surface, but what if we cut the facade, we extend it, and we adapt to these different additions and elements that happen to be there. And we always also even create a new small public space, which is a screen area that separates from this very, traffic heavy street which is in front of it. So we want showing this model that you see, which is a metal element. The project became a very technical question about taking away the asbestos, cladding with this metal element, providing the new insulation, changing the windows. So a very, technical process in a different system again, which is England, with a local architect collaborating with us, so that the building that was, as you see, the building was like this in the 60s, was like this just before. Eventually, it became the project in which we simply added this veil to a building. For us, also rather unusual situation, because we treat only one part of the building, that also plays with the illumination during the night and gives sort of variations of this almost musical score. It looks like that is not our invention. It simply was there in the building of the 1960s, simply by separating it at some point in order to create this different rhythms, and it creates this very small but nevertheless important public space that separates and helps to the people that go there to the space. This is how this project developed, and I'm going to end now with the last project, because the last project is somehow the one that is going to be inaugurated and open in October. Has been probably the most challenging one for us in the last times. We're doing it in this case from the office in Madrid.
First of all, thank you very much for this extremely incredible presentation. Thank you for being here. The first time I listened to your lecture in Milan, it was totally shocking, and to hear you again, it's a big pleasure here.
Thank you.
One question that I wanted to ask you, actually I have 2 questions that I would like to know your opinion. First is that the concept of museum, it's a public building, but you have, here in Georgia, we have the reality that we are in the transition from Soviet reality to the liberal market, and the architecture reflects it very strongly. So if before the client was a state, it becomes a private client. So it is very interesting to hear your opinion, just having the same function, like as a museum, which is a public function. What is the main challenges and differences when you deal with a private client? You just mentioned something during the presentation, but I just want to know in more details, like what's the difference between private client and public client? And there's also a second question that I want to ask you, that most of the time you go underground. In Tbilisi, we have buildings with smaller scale, and this is a challenge that we always have to go underground, but like it's been 1 year I'm back to Georgia, and I know that we are facing already these challenges, that the deepest going underground here happens like 2 floors. And I think that the future of architecture, especially dealing with the old town, will be exactly this issue, just to use the spaces below. So this is also from the expert of dealing with the similar situations, like what are the main problems that we will face in this kind of approach to development. So
thank you. There were many questions. Thank you for listening to me 2 times, because you hear basically the same things 2 times. But in any case, I was especially interested in these days, looking to how is developing here the question, because it has these parallels but also differences from what happened in Spain. Yeah? In Spain it was almost the opposite situation. There was a dictatorship as well, but it was a right-wing dictatorship. So it was very private, but also very, maybe that was also a question why, when I mean very private-oriented, maybe capitalist-oriented. But nevertheless, when democracy came, it was clear in Spain that for the public authorities of the different parties, that it had to be a strong public support of the culture, and not only the culture, also of the social housing. And these two, and therefore also hospitals and so on. But I'm going to talk, for example, about the cultural projects. And then there was this issue of providing public money, sometimes in a bigger scale, but in many cases in a very small scale, in order to produce public space. And the way to do it from the very beginning was organized so that the cities and the cultural institutions had to do a competition by law. So at one point there was in Spain the decision that every public building has to be done through a competition. If not, it's not simply legal. So that opened very much these possibilities of working for public clients, for young architects, as we were at the time. Because with the way of working that, for example, is nowadays extended in Central Europe, for example, in Germany, for us is very, we are established architects, so it's somehow easier to get invited now. But if you are 30 years old, they will never invite you to a museum because you have not done any museum. So I insist, in one point, it's very important to establish a conception of the public work being done by competitions. Saying that, of course, we are working with, that's the reason that most of our public buildings and museum buildings are public clients. Advantages and disadvantages, we are working also for private clients in museum. For example, Mont Blanc is a private museum. Yeah? Advantages and disadvantages are different systems. Definitely, public client respects in principle much more the result of the competition. So once it's won, the question is not anymore so much if somebody likes it or not, it's already won. The project becomes more a project that has to deal with the limited money that is usually the public money, yeah? And then you have to deal with the whole process. Working with a private client, usually the money in that case, being a private museum, was not that much a problem. The problem is that it's their house, and so the opinions are constantly trying to change many things. This is in a very general conception. In terms of what you say of working in the old city, I don't think that it's only about going below ground. We happened to go below ground when we thought it was important, possibly in the case of the second project I show in San Sebastian. There's nothing below ground. It's a rather big building that is built over there. So it's not only that. To me, the most important thing would be how to deal with the scale of the city, of the area. The scale means, in that sense, that I think it's better a not so good building, but good in scale, than a very good building which is wrong in scale, because this will harm much more the space. Of course, playing below ground is avoiding this problem in a way, but adding another one, which is usually a much more expensive project. Than below ground, usually, in most of the places, is expensive. In some cases, it's not even very possible. For example, we are living in Berlin, though we don't have projects in Berlin, we are working in Berlin, but in Berlin it's very difficult to do something below ground because the ground is so bad that it's super expensive. And this is a different situation, yeah. I think I was not probably very precise, but anyway.
Thank you for your visit and for being inspiration. I have a question about the situation that we have right now is in Tbilisi, and I think all over the post-Soviet countries that the design became so much exclusive right now to, let's say, ask architects to come and to make a competition here is quite expensive, as you might know. And what we have in the city is very generic, and it's, as you mentioned also in your concept, very repetitive around the city, especially outskirts. That is this social housing and etc. Now, for our generation is a big question and actually big fight in between generations, also within the same age of the people, what we should be doing with these places and this generic design that is, let's say, I think most of the texture of the Tbilisi is made out of generic design. What we should be doing with this, like just getting rid of it as many want to do, or we should be, let's say, preserving it as much as we would like to preserve something beautiful. So I want to know your suggestion about it, how we should be treating generic in the city.
In principle, I would never be very much of the idea of demolishing things. Whether they are good or bad, we are not now in the way that the planet is developing into demolishing and doing and demolishing and doing. I think it's much more, not only for an economic reason, also for a cultural reason, interesting and important to accept what we have. And what we have, some things we like very much, sometimes a little bit, and sometimes we don't like at all. But there are people living there, and they belong. It's very important, the memory of the place is for the people we all are, that live in a place. A place that might be ugly and really bad for, say, me, it might be a beautiful place for somebody who lived there as a child, because that was their memories and the place, or the place where he got in love for the first time, or the place where I don't know what. So, and in that sense, I believe it's important to try to accept what it is and improve it and transform it. I believe much more in the way of transformation and the idea of transformation than in the idea of, deleting and rebuilding. If this is a very general way of approaching it. Then nevertheless, I never like very general answers, because in our own architecture, we like very much to try to understand a specific thing. In a specific thing, we can react. If you say, generally, what you do with the new buildings in the outskirts of Tbilisi? Generically, I don't know. Let me see in this place or in another. Generically, I would say that what is very important is that it should be an idea of a city. Even there is never an idea which is fixed. This is impossible and makes no sense. But ideas of how to develop, they are not leaving to the absolutely liberty of the private developer to do whatever they want. This makes no sense at all for the city. There has to be a balance, and this balance is how the only thing in my experience that I see works is the balance. I mean, public development cannot do it. It has not the means. Private development is basically only interested in money. So there has to be definitely a balance, and if one of the legs fails, then it's not possible. I would say that in these existing areas that maybe are not the most better, I mean the better at all, it would be very important how to treat the public space, whatever is in between. The space, if you think in a city, we by default, we think in the buildings. But if you think in the empty spaces, there are many more. Imagine a written letter. The white paper is bigger than the letters. So the space in between is a key question, and there it's very important the public intervention with rules, with laws, or with, even when possible, also with public intervention. For example, it was very successful in modern recent city interventions. It's well known, the Barcelona system of the 1980s, before the Olympics, 1990, because there was not that much money, but there was this idea that the city had to take care of these empty spaces here and there. So what they did is these small competitions or small groups of very young architects at the time, years 85 to 92 or something, and they selected this area which is in decay, in between this, bad area of the city or whatever. And these young groups did these plazas, open spaces, public spaces that became a model because in a way they helped to improve the area that surrounded. So I think this is a key question, and you as architects should fight to achieve somebody in the politics to get to these laws. Yeah.
I have 3 questions. First is, I noticed that you are achieving complexity through repeating same patterns, and I was wondering the actual design process behind it. Are you using like programming or parametric design forms, or what are the tools which are from which you are achieving the results? The second question is more personal. I noticed that you are using this pentagon shape quite often. Do you have a personal connection with this shape, or what is the reason behind it? And the third question is, do you have like internship opportunities for international students which are interested to have some experience with your studio?
Well, yes, about this idea of achieving complexity with few elements is something that is not that I knew, and we knew when I talk also with my partner. We are two, Santa Nieto and myself. No? But it's not that we knew since we were young. It's something that you learn step by step. No? This idea that everything that we started to see in the world, not only architecture but definitely also architecture, that is really powerful and good, seemed to be so simple. No? It's something that we say, well, it looks so simple, but it was so strong. Whereas when the projects appear to be, or the forms or the shapes, or even a novel or even a film, too vague or too complex, or there was something wrong. So at some point, looking to geometry, one can understand that everything in life is about combinatorial thing. I mean, we are talking, in this case in English, and we're using only 26 or 25 letters, and these letters create, thoughts and so on. Or music. I mean, I have learned a lot with Arvo Pärt himself, a musician that takes it to the limit of using the minimal in order to create this. So in a way, this is a real important concept. Whether we use computer programs or not, of course, now we use it. I'm the analogical guy in the office because I'm the oldest, and though I use computers, but I simply draw with my hands. And for example, a project that opened many of these questions, like the one in Cordoba, this contemporary art center, which is hexagons that are combined and so on. it's very interesting because after it was published and known, there came at least in 2 or 3 cases. I remember specifically a French mathematician who is writing a book and say, I'm so interested in this project because you develop a project with the Voronoi geometries and how did you develop the program, blah, blah, blah. I said, no, I did models with my hand and then I put them together and then we do sketches and then we formalized and then we went to the computer and we made it possible. So it was the other way around. So I believe the computers will change and are changing very much the way we think. It will be coming more and more, but I still believe in the ideas as a starting point. This is definitely how I see it. The third question, you can send your CV, and sometimes we have architecture, though you see a lot of work here, but it's a lot of work of many years. Sometimes it's in peaks and sometimes down. So, and in architecture, like in life, in many cases, it's being in the right moment and say, yes, now we need a person to be an intern. Yeah. Usually there are interns, but it's always, changing. Yeah. I forgot a question, no? Oh, no, that was, no. The person, the Pentagon, yeah, the Pentagon. No, the Pentagon, actually we are, it is a very interesting shape because, of course, there is, when studying about all these patterns, I mean, you know, there are these patterns that achieve the maximum surface with the minimum number of elements, and one thinks immediately of the bees and the hexagon, no? Hexagon, which is a theme in architecture. Frank, you're right, we're doing with hexagons and so on. But hexagon has certain geometrical connections that make it more repetitive than the pentagon. The pentagon, in the very moment you change the scale, it becomes almost like a fractal system that every angle creates a much more variety. So in a way, it started to be a way of playing with geometry. Like maybe a musician can play with, you know, trying to see this chord or this other one. And nowadays it became a theme that we try to make always in different ways. For example, an arbor part is a negative one. It's a patio. Whereas in the beginning, that's the reason I showed the temporary market. It was a very modest project, cheap to be demolished, and it was the starting of an idea. So to me, the most important thing is that sometimes a small project can become the most challenging, and sometimes a very big and expensive one is not.